If you dance this tango with me, I'll marry you right here in front of everyone,"
shouted the Mafia boss, Javier Montero, standing at the heart of the Palacio de Madrid, holding a glass of champagne, his face adorned with a mocking grin. His words sliced through the heavy silence of the room like a whip, and instantly the laughter of the guests erupted. The sound of their mocking laughter echoed off the crystal chandeliers, bounced off the gilded walls, and reverberated on the marble floors, which seemed to tremble under the click of high heels and polished shoes. Amidst trays of drinks and subtle shadows, there she was. Lucía Morales, in her black uniform with a white apron, struggled to hold back the tremble in her hands as the crowd pointed at her as if she were part of a cheap show. Everyone expected her to refuse, flee, or crumble in tears. No one could have imagined that that very night in that same hall, destiny would take a turn that would silence even the last of those laughter. The crystal chandeliers sparkled like little suns suspended above the grand ballroom of the Hotel Palacio de Madrid. The music of the orchestra floated in the air, elegant and measured, as if every note bowed reverently to the impeccably dressed guests in silk gowns who laughed with champagne glasses in hand. In the midst of such luxury, he commanded the space. Javier Montero, the capital's most coveted heir, walked with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a no. His black tuxedo, pristine white vest, and that half-smile of self-assuredness made him the inevitable center of all eyes. At the edge, among the trays and discreet movements, stood she, Lucía Morales, in her black uniform with a white apron, her hair tied back in a low bun, revealing the delicacy of her face. She wore no jewelry, no adornments, only the silence of someone who had learned to be invisible among others' abundance. The guests murmured curiously as Javier raised his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, tapping his glass with a silver spoon, "tonight I want to conduct an experiment." Some laughed, others waited, intrigued. Javier walked over to Lucía, who was holding a tray of glasses. His steps echoed on the marble floor, and when he stood before her, he extended his hand with calculated theatricality. Lucía's name left his lips like the words of an exotic game. "If you dance this tango with me, I'll marry you right here in front of everyone." The room erupted in laughter. Some guests covered their mouths pretending to be scandalized, while others whispered to one another with cruelty. The orchestra stopped for a moment, as if it too were waiting for a reaction. Lucía felt the tray tremble in her hands. The heat rose to her cheeks, but she did not lower her gaze. Her eyes met Javier's, and though his mockery aimed to reduce her to nothing more than a spectacle, in that gaze there was something more, a silent strength that none of the present guests could decipher. He smiled, confident that she would retreat. The rest of the guests shifted in their seats, eager to watch the performance, already certain of the outcome. But Lucía did not move. Her fingers tightened around the tray, her lips pressed into a firm line. The entire room hung in a heavy silence, waiting. If this story has moved you in these first moments, let us know where you're watching from in the comments and leave a like to continue following us. The laughter spread like a cruel echo, resounding in every corner of the room. The gold of the chandeliers and the shine of the dresses seemed to amplify the mockery. The women in silver sequined dresses covered their mouths, pretending to be scandalized, while the men with brandy glasses leaned forward to catch every detail. Javier opened his arms wide, as if presenting a circus show. "Look at her," he exclaimed with disdain. "Our dear servant turned into a princess for the night, if she dares." The room burst into another wave of laughter. Lucía lowered her gaze. Her hands tightened around her white apron, and her chest pounded as though her heart were a hammer. She didn't want them to see her tremble. She didn't want to give them more reasons to laugh, but the crowd wouldn't settle. They were waiting for her humiliation, as one waits for a toast. "Come on, Lucía." Javier leaned toward her, smiling arrogantly. "Don't be afraid. It's just a tango. Or maybe you don't even know how to dance." The cruelty of the question landed like a lash. Some guests chuckled theatrically, as if the mockery had crossed a delicious boundary. A young woman in a jade green dress murmured, "Are you sure she even knows what a tango is?" Lucía took a deep breath. The air burned in her throat, but she didn't raise her voice. She held on to that silence she had so often used as armor, though inside she was crumbling. Javier turned toward the crowd, relishing every second. "Gentlemen, I believe we have our answer. A servant is only good for cleaning glasses, not for dancing with a Montero." The laughter was even more biting. In that moment, Lucía closed her eyes for a second. She recalled the touch of strong arms, the music of a distant bandoneon, and her mother's voice whispering to her as a child, "Dance with your heart, daughter, not with your feet." Her breathing slowed, and when she opened her eyes again, they were no longer the same. There was a glint in them, a fire that no one expected to find in the woman in a simple uniform. The room, still laughing, had no idea what was about to unfold. Silence took over the space like an unexpected shadow. The laughter, which just moments before had filled the room, now floated in the air, broken and uncertain. Lucía slowly lifted her head. It was not a sharp or defiant gesture. It was as though some ancient force had pushed her to show for the first time in years that she was not invisible. Her eyes swept across the rows of faces that watched her. She saw red-painted lips twisting into cruel smiles. She saw gold cufflinks shining on the sleeves of men who believed they owned the night. And in the end, she found Javier Montero's eyes. He wore that arrogant, confident smile, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who thought they had the power to decide everyone's fate. "What's the matter, Lucía?" he asked with mockery, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you really going to accept?" She didn't respond. She carefully placed the tray on a nearby table. The sound of the crystal glasses clinking together was sharp, like a gunshot in the middle of the silence. Some guests jumped in surprise. Others leaned forward, convinced they were about to witness the final humiliation. Javier took a step toward her. "Come on," he said, bending toward her with feigned courtesy. "Don't be afraid. It's just a tango. Though, of course, you might not even know what that is." A dry laugh escaped from a man with a thin mustache. "How bold," he commented, delighted. "A servant thinking she's a dancer." The woman in the jade green dress added almost without holding back her laughter, "She'll probably trip over her own feet." Lucía heard it all, but never took her eyes off Javier. She had learned to endure the poison of words, the weight of the looks that reduced her to nothing. Yet something was different inside her that night. She took a deep breath. The air filled her lungs as though she had been holding it in for years. She straightened her shoulders and with firm steps took a few steps toward the center of the room. The murmur of the guests rose like a wave. "Did you see that?" whispered a woman with silver hair. She actually moved. Javier smiled even more, convinced that he still controlled the situation. He extended his hand dramatically, like an actor enjoying the attention. "So will you dance this tango with me?" The gazes of everyone in the room fixed on her with an intensity that was almost unbearable. The orchestra waited, motionless, the violins suspended in the air, the musicians' fingers frozen on the strings. Time seemed to stop in that chandelier-lit palace. Lucía did not respond with words. She took another step, then another, until she stood before him. Javier's heart raced with the excitement of the performance he believed he had orchestrated. But when Lucía's hand touched his, something shifted. It was a firm, secure grip, unexpected in someone everyone had written off as defeated. The entire room burst into a murmur of disbelief. No one breathed normally. No one knew what would happen in the seconds to come. Yet, everyone felt they were about to witness something they would never forget. The orchestra conductor raised his baton hesitantly, glancing at the guests. No one wanted to be the first to break that silence that had grown unbearable. It was Javier who made the first move, snapping his fingers. "A tango," he ordered triumphantly. "Let them all remember." The first notes of the bandoneon slipped through the air like a melancholy sigh, filling every corner of the room. The violin joined with a soft lament, and suddenly the atmosphere changed. The mockery began to turn into something else, something that felt like anticipation. Javier took Lucía by the waist, confident. His hand descended firmly as if to remind her who was in control. "Relax," he whispered with irony. "You just have to follow me." But Lucía didn't react the way he expected. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. Her eyes, fixed on his, shone with a calmness that threw him off balance. The first step echoed across the marble floor. Javier led with wide, exaggerated movements, eager to provoke laughter from the onlookers. The crowd held its breath, waiting for her to trip, lose her balance, and confirm the mockery. It didn't happen. Lucía moved with a grace no one could comprehend. Her simple skirt brushed the ground with perfect precision. Her feet seemed to know every beat of the music by heart. There was no hesitation, no fear. Javier raised an incredulous eyebrow. He tried to perform a quick turn to trip her up, but she followed his every move like a perfect shadow, effortlessly. A murmur rippled through the guests. Did you see that? Sweat began to bead on Javier's forehead. He couldn't let this woman, the one he had humiliated, outshine him in his own game. He tightened his grip around her waist, almost angrily, and whispered between clenched teeth, "Where did you learn to move like that?" Lucía didn't respond, only lowered her gaze for a moment. In that silent gesture, something stronger than 1,000 words appeared. Memory, pain, and the absence of a voice still whispering in her heart. Even the musicians seemed to sense it. The bandoneon cried with more intensity. The violins screamed with high-pitched notes. The tango was no longer a mockery, it had become a duel. The crowd, captivated, leaned in. No one laughed now. Fans slammed shut. Champagne glasses were left forgotten on the tables. All the opulence of the palace faded into one singular scene. An anonymous servant, challenging the Mafia boss in front of everyone with the purity of her dance. What had been a laughingstock moments ago was now transforming into a trembling secret of respect. The tango surged like an electric current that took hold of everyone in the room. Each note from the bandoneon pierced the skin. Every beat of the double bass made the golden walls of the hall vibrate. The guests who had laughed before were now silent, hypnotized by a scene none of them had imagined. Lucía spun with a precision that seemed impossible for someone dressed in a servant's uniform. Her feet glided across the marble flawlessly, marking the rhythm with a certainty that didn't ask for permission. Every movement had the strength of someone who had loved in silence, who had kept a secret fire burning for years. Javier tried to regain control. He gripped her roughly, guiding her into a faster turn, hoping she would stumble. But Lucía responded with a surprising fluidity. Her skirt spun like a dark wing, and her arms found perfect balance. The crowd murmured in awe. "Did you see that?" whispered a woman with a red fan. "She's not just dancing, she's dominating." An older man with a grey mustache shook his head, incredulous. "This is no accident. This woman has trained. You can tell." Javier forced a smile, but inside humiliation began to burn. His game was slipping through his fingers. What was supposed to be a cruel joke was turning into a spectacle that exposed him. "Don't get too confident," he whispered under his breath as he pushed her back with more violent steps. Lucía held his gaze. Her dark eyes sparkled with something no one in the room had ever seen in her. Ferocious dignity, silent and unbreakable. The tango grew. The orchestra, infected by the intensity, increased the power of its notes. The violins screeched, the piano pounded with force, and the bandoneon bled with every chord. Lucía stepped forward, forcing Javier to step back. To many, this shift was imperceptible, but to those who understood the language of tango, it was clear. She was no longer following. She was leading. A lone clap erupted from the back. No one dared to join, but the echo of those palms broke the tension in the air. Javier's face hardened. He clenched his jaw like a cornered animal. "Who are you, really?" he whispered desperately in her ear. Lucía didn't answer. She let herself be carried by the music, by the memory of her mother on those afternoons when tango had been her refuge. Each step was a tribute to that lost voice that still lived in her chest. The guests no longer looked at her with disdain. There was awe, respect, and, in some eyes, even a flicker of envy. The ridicule they had expected had transformed into an unexpected miracle. And as the music continued to burn in the air, an undeniable truth began to settle over the room. That woman wasn't there to be humiliated. She was there to unleash a truth no one had imagined. The tango blazed in the air like an unquenchable fire. The orchestra, fueled by the energy of the moment, played with such force that the crystal chandeliers trembled. No one dared to speak. The opulence of the room had become a silent theater, where everyone was a witness to a mystery unfolding before their eyes. Lucía spun with a hypnotic precision. Each step was a blow of memory. The sound of the bandoneon reminded her of the afternoons when her mother, in a humble courtyard, would spin her between hanging sheets. "Dance with your heart, daughter, not with your feet." That woman's voice returned clearly to her now, restoring the strength she had once thought lost. Javier tried to impose his will, pushing, pulling, marking violent steps, but each attempt at control left him more exposed. His face, once a mask of arrogance, now twisted with the tension of someone beginning to lose. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his lips pressed together, betraying his fear of being humiliated. "This can't be real," murmured a woman in a gold dress, her eyes fixed on the pair. "Look closely," answered an older man in a gravelly voice. That woman didn't learn in secret. She was born for this. Lucia's steps became bolder. A sudden turn left her with her back to Javier, and as she glanced over her shoulder, her gaze radiated a confidence that froze the Mafia boss's blood. She was no longer the submissive servant he had wanted to display. She was something else. The crowd held its breath. In every pause in the music, in every silence between beats, everyone's heart stopped. Even the waiters hidden in the shadows of the hall had abandoned their trays to watch. Lucia closed her eyes for a moment and let herself be carried by the melody. In her mind, her mother's image appeared, her laughter, her hands guiding Lucia's when she was just a child. The pain of loss turned into strength. Every movement was a conversation with that beloved ghost that still lived within her. Javier felt it. He sensed that the woman he had tried to ridicule was dancing with an invisible ally, with an indomitable force. His fingers tightened around Lucia's waist in desperation. "Who are you?" he hissed with contained rage. Lucia opened her eyes, and in the middle of that opulent, cruel hall, she looked at him calmly. She didn't say a word, but her silence was more humiliating than any verbal response. The music reached a crescendo. The violins ripped through the air, the piano struck like thunder, and the bandoneon wailed as if it were breaking from the inside. The audience stood, not knowing why, carried away by an emotion they could no longer contain. What had started as a mockery had transformed into a ritual, and everyone understood that they were witnessing something unique. The tango reached impossible heights. The music was a roar that made the stained glass windows tremble, a lament and a scream all at once. The air was so thick with tension that it felt like the chandeliers would shatter if anyone breathed too hard. Lucia spun with relentless grace. There was no stumbling, no error. Each movement was perfect, as if the music had been written for her. Her simple dress moved with an unexpected dignity, as if the humble fabric had turned to silk under the light of the room. Javier, on the other hand, was becoming more and more clumsy. The arrogance of his first steps had completely vanished. Now it was desperation guiding him. He tried to impose sharp spins, sudden shifts in rhythm, but each time he did, it was he who lost his balance. Lucia, on the other hand, flowed naturally, forcing him to follow her without anyone noticing. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath, his lips brushing her ear. Lucia heard him but didn't reply. Her eyes stayed fixed on an invisible point, in that sacred memory where her mother still danced beside her. She didn't need words. Her silence was a sharper weapon than any phrase could ever be. In the upper balconies, the guests began murmuring in a different tone. No longer were there laughs, no longer mockery, only whispers filled with awe. "I know her," said an older woman, narrowing her eyes. "Those moves, those turns, it can't be," a man next to her replied. "She disappeared years ago." Below, near the tables, a businessman raised his glass without taking his eyes off her. "That woman is no simple servant. She has the blood of art in her veins." The tension escalated further when Javier, desperate to regain attention, attempted a risky move. He yanked Lucia abruptly to make her spin backward and pull her against his chest. But his force was so clumsy that he almost knocked her down. A stifled gasp ran through the hall. Lucia, however, didn't fall. She held herself with a steadiness that left everyone breathless. Her feet found the perfect rhythm, and instead of the fall everyone feared, she executed a flawless turn, now facing Javier, her face only inches from his. The crowd erupted into spontaneous applause. It was uncommon to clap in the middle of a dance, but no one could contain themselves. The entire hall vibrated with a new energy: admiration, disbelief, pure emotion. Javier, now flushed, gritted his teeth. He could feel the night, which was meant to reaffirm his power, turning into his greatest humiliation. And worst of all, the gaze of every single person in the room was no longer on him, it was on her. The music kept swelling, as if sensing that something was about to be revealed. And in that moment, many began to understand that Lucía Morales was not the woman they thought she was. The last chord of the bandoneon lingered in the air like an invisible thread no one wanted to let go of. The violins slowly faded. The piano released a deep note, and suddenly the silence was absolute. Lucía stood still, her breath ragged, her face flushed from the effort. Javier still held her, but his hands were trembling. The mask of confidence had crumbled. Now it was he who seemed small in front of her. The crowd didn't applaud immediately. They were too stunned. The echo of the tango still vibrated in every guest's bones. No one knew if they should break that sacred moment with something as vulgar as clapping, until a solitary applause rang out from the back of the room. An elderly man in a dark suit and white hair had made the first move. Others followed, and within seconds the entire palace stood to applaud. The claps resonated like thunder. Some shouted bravo, others cried without knowing why, and many looked at each other in disbelief. The servant, who minutes before had been the subject of mockery, had conquered every heart in that room. Lucía lowered her gaze humbly, accepting the recognition she had never sought. But Javier was frozen. His cheeks burned with shame. The applause wasn't for him. It never had been, and that truth tore him apart. Amid the booming of hands, a voice rose clear and strong, breaking the air. "That woman is no stranger." The entire room fell silent. The hands stopped clapping and breaths froze. Everyone turned to the man who had spoken, an elegant elderly man seated in the front row with a white handkerchief in his pocket. Slowly, he stood up. His gaze fixed on Lucía, and his lips trembled before he spoke the following words. She is the daughter of Isabel Morales, the great dancer." A murmur rippled through the room like a lightning bolt. Isabel Morales from the Teatro Colón. Impossible. She died over a decade ago. Lucía's eyes welled up upon hearing that name. Her chest tightened, as if an invisible knot were choking her. She had never wanted to hear that truth in public. She had never wanted to carry that surname in front of strangers. But now there was no hiding it. The elderly man stepped forward, moved. I recognized it in her turns, in the strength of her arms, he said with a trembling voice. "You dance just like your mother, with the same pure heart." The room erupted into an even louder murmur, mixed with gasps of disbelief and tears of astonishment. Lucía, her voice barely holding together, whispered, "Yes, I am her daughter." The secret had been laid bare, and the air thickened with the weight of the revelation. The buzz of the crowd was deafening. Some couldn't process what they had just heard, their minds struggling to accept the truth. Others in the corners of the room began digging through their memories, trying to recall performances from the past, when they had seen the legendary Isabel Morales captivate audiences across European stages. Javier swallowed hard. That surname, it echoed in his mind, the faintest spark of recognition, yet he had never imagined that the woman who served drinks in his own palace could be tied to such a legacy. Lucía stood there, frozen, her breath coming in short, labored bursts. Her heart was a storm inside her chest, torn between fleeing and standing her ground. Her hands trembled, but not from shame. No, this tremor came from something deeper. The past had cracked open, exposing a wound that had never fully healed, and she was no longer sure how to contain it. The elderly man who had recognized her moved toward her slowly, the years weighing on his steps, until he was directly in front of her. "Your mother was a legend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw her dance in this very country many years ago. No one had her fire, her passion, and now I see it in you." Lucía lowered her gaze, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. "My mother passed away when I was just a little girl," she whispered softly, her voice trembling. The illness consumed her in silence, far from the stages, far from everything she loved. The guests fell into a profound silence. Even the most arrogant among them, those who had laughed only moments ago, now stood motionless, completely captivated by the depth of the moment. Lucia's voice broke again, and she continued, barely able to contain her emotions. After she died, I went to look for my father, but he shut the door in my face. He never wanted to acknowledge me as his daughter. To him, I was nothing but a mistake, a reminder of something he couldn't erase. A murmur of outrage rippled through the room. A woman wearing a pearl necklace placed her hand over her heart. "How cruel," she murmured under her breath. Lucia took a deep, steadying breath. Her eyes, now brimming with unshed tears, shone with a quiet strength. "I grew up alone, with only the memory of my mother to guide me," she continued, her voice softening. "Though dancing was in my blood, I couldn't bring myself to do it. The music reminded me too much of her absence, of the hole she left behind." Her gaze swept over the room, taking in the shocked expressions of the guests. "I ended up taking whatever job I could find to survive, and this place became my shelter. Being a servant was the only way I could hide from who I really was, from the truth of who my mother had been." The room fell into an almost sacred silence. No one dared to move or speak. It was as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of her words. Javier, feeling the tide of attention slipping away from him, unable to hold on to the spotlight any longer, tried to interject with a voice laced with sarcasm. "So, you chose to hide behind a uniform then? What's the point of having a gift if you bury it under shame?" His words cut through the air like a slap, but Lucia didn't flinch. She turned her head slightly to face him, her gaze calm, unwavering. Her eyes held no anger, no bitterness, only something deeper, something that he could never have understood. "It wasn't shame," she said, her voice steady. "It was pain. Dance was never just about movement to me. It was about losing her again, every single night, and that's why I stayed silent, that's why I hid from the world." The elderly man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice shaking with emotion. "And yet tonight, you've brought her back," he said. "Your mother is here in every step you take." Lucia closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the tears to fall freely, no longer held back by the walls she had built around herself. But these weren't tears of sadness, no. They were tears of liberation. The weight she had carried for so long had been lifted, even if just for a moment. The room, which had once been filled with laughter and mockery, was now filled with reverence. The crowd had gone from disbelief to awe, and the man who had tried to degrade her was now shrinking under the weight of his own actions. Javier stood frozen in place, his face flushed with embarrassment. He couldn't escape the truth that was now on display for everyone to see, and in the silence that followed, a voice broke through the tension. "That woman is no stranger," a man called out from the back, his voice loud and clear. The entire room fell silent at once. Hands stopped clapping, breaths were held. Everyone turned to look at the man who had spoken. He was an elderly, distinguished figure sitting in the front row, wearing a dark suit with a white handkerchief peeking out of his breast pocket. Slowly, he stood up, his eyes locking on Lucia as he spoke, his voice quivering with emotion. She is the daughter of Isabel Morales, the great dancer." A wave of disbelief washed over the guests. "Isabel Morales? From the Teatro Colón? Impossible! She died over a decade ago." The murmurs spread like wildfire through the crowd. Lucia's heart clenched at the mention of her mother's name. She could feel the weight of the years bearing down on her, the memories flooding her mind. She had never wanted to hear that name spoken aloud in front of strangers. She had never wanted to bear that surname so publicly. But now, there was no turning back. The elderly man stepped closer, visibly moved. "I recognized it in her turns, in the strength of her arms," he said with trembling hands. "You dance just like your mother, with the same pure heart." The room stood frozen, stunned by the weight of the revelation. The music, the tension, the emotions in the room all swirled together. Lucia, the woman who had been nothing more than a servant, had become the rightful heir to a legacy she had never asked for, but had always carried within her. And the man who had tried to humiliate her, to make her a spectacle, now stood exposed for his cruelty. Javier took a hesitant step forward, brushing off the invisible dust from his jacket, his face still contorted with shame. He had underestimated Lucía in every possible way, and now there was no way to escape the truth that had been laid bare before him and everyone else in the room. His lips trembled with a mix of rage and disbelief. He could not allow the night, which he had meticulously planned to showcase his power, to end by crowning the woman he had treated as nothing more than entertainment. "Enough with the theatrics," he exclaimed, raising his voice above the now emotional murmurs of the guests. "Don't be fooled by a forgotten name. Maybe this woman knows how to move her feet, but she's still just a servant who serves drinks in my house." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling heavily in the air. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Javier's tone, instead of commanding respect, sounded desperate and frantic. A woman with silver hair stared at him harshly. "Don't speak like that," she said firmly. "What we saw was not a whim, it was art." The elderly man who had recognized Lucía raised his hand in indignation. "A servant? No, Señor Montero. This woman carries in her blood the legacy of Isabel Morales, and tonight she has proven it before all of us." The murmurs grew louder. There was a clear sense of indignation. Whispers of disapproval for the Mafia boss, who had been the center of attention moments earlier, began to spread across the room. Javier clenched his fists and took a step toward Lucía. "And you," he said, his voice bitter. "Do you enjoy this? Do you enjoy seeing me humiliated?" Lucía looked at him without lowering her gaze. The trembling young woman holding a tray was gone. In her place stood a woman who was upright, with dry tears glistening on her face and an unbreakable dignity in her eyes. "I didn't seek to humiliate you, Javier," she said calmly. "I simply accepted your challenge. You called me to the center of this room." The guests nodded silently. It was true, everyone had heard it. "She didn't seek the spotlight," a voice called out from the crowd. "It was you who exposed her." The color drained from Javier's face. Never in his life had anyone dared to confront him like this, especially not in front of the elite gathered in his palace. "This is absurd," he bellowed, though his voice lacked the strength it once had. Lucía took a deep breath and looked him squarely in the eyes. "I am not absurd," she said firmly. "I am the daughter of a mother who taught me to dance with my heart, and though I hid it for years, tonight I have found it again." A spontaneous round of applause swept across the room. This time it wasn't timid or isolated, it was a collective roar of admiration. The guests stood up, clapping with fervor. Javier stood surrounded by an ovation that did not belong to him. He tried to smile, but the gesture faltered. The power that had always protected him was crumbling before his eyes, and in that moment he realized something that struck him like a knife. The humiliation was no longer Lucía's. It was his. The applause echoed through the golden walls of the hall, a thunderous sound that drowned out everything else. Javier, now flushed with embarrassment, raised his hands in an attempt to silence the room. It was hard to breathe. He could feel the weight of 100 gazes piercing through him like knives. The mask of the untouchable millionaire had fallen, and he knew it. "Listen to me," he said, his voice trembling, trying to sound firm. This was all a misunderstanding. A murmur of distrust spread among the guests. No one seemed to believe him. Javier took a step toward Lucía. "I didn't mean to offend you," he added, forcing a smile. "What happened here was unexpected. I admit that I was wrong in how I approached this, but—" He paused dramatically. "Perhaps fate wanted us to meet this way." The word fate hung heavily in the air. Some looked at him incredulously, others with disdain. "Fate?" a woman in a red dress repeated, almost spitting the word. "You humiliated her in front of everyone." Javier ignored the comment and stepped closer to Lucía, extending his hand with a solemn gesture. "Lucía Morales," he said, emphasizing her last name as though trying to take ownership of it. "Tonight, you've shown us who you are. A strong woman, a true artist, I ask for your forgiveness." The silence that followed was thick. Everyone waited for Lucía's response. She observed him quietly, her breathing calm, though inside a storm of memories and emotions surged through her. She remembered her mother's words, telling her that dignity was never to be compromised, that the purity of the heart was worth more than any wealth. "Forgiveness," she said finally, her voice firm. "Do you even know what that word means, Javier? It's not a trick to cleanse your wounded pride. Forgiveness is an act of truth, and you have yet to understand that." The crowd reacted with an intense murmur. No one had ever dared to speak to Javier Montero like this. He took half a step back, bewildered. I can change. I promise," he stammered. Lucía shook her head gently. "I don't want you to change for me. If you ever change, it will be for yourself." The elderly man who had recognized Lucía stepped forward with authority, his voice rising above the growing murmurs in the room. "This woman doesn't need your surname or your money," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "She already possesses the greatest thing, dignity, which you tried to strip from her." A sudden, thunderous applause followed his words, shaking the very walls of the grand hall. The guests, who had previously been silent spectators, now rose together as one, not just to admire the dance, but to defend Lucía. It was as if an invisible force had swept through the room, transforming their indifference into support. Javier stood there, cornered. His carefully crafted evening, designed to highlight his power and superiority, had unraveled before his very eyes. Lucía, standing tall in the center of the room, took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into her chest. The serenity in her posture was both a relief and a source of deep admiration for everyone who witnessed it. In the face of all the cruelty and mockery, she remained calm, poised, and strong. She had not just found her voice again, she had found her truth. "I hold no grudge, Javier, but I will not play your game again," Lucía declared, her voice unwavering. "Tonight didn't change my destiny, it changed yours." The room erupted into cheers, the sound echoing off the walls and shaking the marble floors. Lucía's words struck like lightning, an unrelenting force that left everyone in awe. Javier, beaten down by the weight of his own arrogance, lowered his head for the first time in his life. The power that he had once wielded so effortlessly, a weapon in his hands, now felt fragile, crumbling under the truth Lucía had revealed. The room that had once been filled with mockery and the sound of his self-importance had now transformed into a sanctuary of respect and admiration for Lucía. She stood in the center, her servant's uniform still on, but her presence radiated an undeniable power. She had become a beacon of strength, a symbol of resilience. The elderly man, who had recognized Lucía as Isabel Morales' daughter, raised his glass, his voice filled with solemnity and respect. "Tonight we've witnessed a miracle," he said, his words carrying the weight of generations. "Not just the return of the spirit of Isabel Morales, but the redemption of her legacy through the strength of her daughter." The guests, now fully moved, raised their glasses, toasting in unison. Some of them, tears in their eyes, began chanting her name, "Lucía, Lucía." Javier, standing in the corner, his face pale and flushed with embarrassment, felt the sting of every eye in the room. The guests who had once adored him now turned their gaze away, ashamed of their blind admiration. The humiliation that he had so carefully tried to impose on Lucía had now turned on him. The very people who had once laughed at her, who had seen her as nothing more than a servant, were now standing in her defense, their respect for her growing by the second. Lucía, standing in the center of the room, breathed deeply. She stepped forward, her voice now carrying the weight of everything she had lived through. She had endured the laughter, the mockery, the pain of losing her mother. But now, in this moment, she had found a strength she never thought possible. "I didn't seek this night," she began, her tone calm but strong. "I didn't ask to be in the center of this, but I've learned that hiding who we are is a form of abandonment. For years, I stayed silent out of pain, out of fear. But today I understand that my mother didn't die completely. She lives on in every step I dance." Her words hit the audience like a powerful wave, each syllable carrying the weight of her journey. Some cried openly, others stood frozen, captivated by her raw honesty. The silence in the room deepened, the guests holding their breath as Lucía continued. "Forgiveness exists," she said, "but it's not about excusing cruelty. It's about not letting it steal from us what we hold dear. Tonight, I didn't dance for Javier, nor for any of you. I danced to honor my mother and to remind myself and all of you that even in the face of humiliation, hope can still rise. The applause that followed this time was no longer just polite clapping. It was a collective roar, a deep, heartfelt appreciation for what Lucía had just revealed. The entire room stood, clapping with intensity, their respect for her evident. The musicians, who had remained silent up until that point, now tapped their instruments, their music no longer a mere performance, but an offering of respect. Lucía's words had pierced through the walls of arrogance and self-interest that had once filled the room, leaving only truth and admiration in their wake. Javier, standing in the corner, could no longer hide. The applause that surrounded him now felt like a reminder of his own failure, of the illusion he had created around himself. Lucía turned her gaze toward him one final time. This time it wasn't filled with anger. There was no bitterness. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as though she had already won the battle for her own dignity. I hope, Javier, that one day you'll learn that true greatness isn't measured by wealth or mockery. It's measured by the ability to connect with a pure heart. Javier, broken and confused, lowered his head, unable to respond. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than any insult he had ever thrown at anyone. The orchestra, on their own initiative, began to play a soft, haunting melody, one not of mockery or spectacle, but of homage. Lucía, with graceful steps, made her way toward the exit of the hall. As she walked, the applause continued to follow her, a rhythmic accompaniment to her departure. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a victory, not of defeat, but of truth. That night, Madrid would remember only one name, and it would no longer be Javier Montero's. The story that had begun with arrogance and mockery had transformed into a powerful lesson in dignity, resilience, and love for one's heritage. Lucía Morales, once a woman invisible to the world, had now become a symbol of hope and strength. Her mother's legacy, long buried in the shadows, had come alive again through Lucía's courage. The guests, who had once been in awe of Javier's power, now looked at him with disdain. The same people who had once admired his every word now avoided his gaze, their eyes filled with judgment. The elderly man, who had been the first to recognize Lucía's true identity, raised his glass once more. "Tonight we have seen a miracle," he repeated, his voice rich with emotion. "Not just the return of Isabel Morales' spirit, but the redemption of her legacy through the strength of her daughter." Lucía, who had once been nothing but a servant, now stood as the embodiment of honor, love, and artistic brilliance. She didn't need riches or famous surnames. What she needed was her connection to her mother's memory, the strength she had carried within her all those years, and the courage to stand up for who she truly was. As Lucía made her way toward the exit, the last remnants of the applause continued to echo in the room. The once strong figure of Javier Montero now seemed a distant memory, dwarfed by the power of the truth that had just been laid bare. Lucía had become the symbol of respect and hope for all who witnessed her journey. And in that moment, the world of wealth, mockery, and power that Javier had so carefully curated seemed meaningless in the face of a woman who had embraced her heritage, her strength, and her dignity. As the door to the grand hall closed behind Lucía, leaving the crowd still applauding in her wake, the final truth settled in. The night that had begun with an attempt to humiliate had, in the end, revealed the silent strength of a woman who had carried pain, abandonment, and loss, but had never lost the purity of her heart. Javier Montero, on the other hand, had learned in the hardest way possible that arrogance can never withstand dignity. The luxury, the applause bought with wealth, and the fake friendships dissolved in an instant when the truth was exposed. And though he begged for forgiveness, he realized too late that true forgiveness cannot be demanded. It must be earned with humility and change. The entire room had witnessed not just a performance, but a simple miracle. A woman who had once seemed invisible had become a symbol of strength, respect, and hope. Because, in the end, what remains isn't mockery or wealth. It's the capacity to forgive, to keep faith in family, to honor those we love, and to dance with our souls open, even in the face of pain. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our upcoming stories. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And before you go, check out the story I've left here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect. As Lucía continued to walk toward the exit, the applause began to crescendo, as if the very walls of the palace were reverberating in response to her strength. With every step she took, the guests who had once been blind to her existence now stood in awe of her. Their eyes followed her, some still unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The transformation had been so sudden, so powerful, that even the most seasoned in the room struggled to find the words to describe what had unfolded. For so long, Lucía had lived in the shadows, hidden beneath the veil of service, her true identity obscured by her mother's death, by the neglect of her father, and by the role she had assumed in the world. But tonight, everything had changed. Lucía was no longer the quiet servant carrying trays and attending to others' needs. She was a force that had been awakened by the simple act of dancing, by the raw emotion and the love she had carried for her mother all these years. It was a love that could not be silenced, no matter how much she had tried to bury it. Javier, still standing in the corner, could barely comprehend what had just happened. The weight of his defeat pressed heavily on him. His mind raced, replaying every moment, every word he had said. How had it come to this? He had expected to dominate the room, to be the center of attention, but instead he had found himself exposed, humiliated. The crowd, once eager to bask in his wealth and charisma, had turned against him. Lucía had done what he thought was impossible. She had taken control of the narrative, rewriting the story of the evening with her own truth. As the room filled with the sound of continued applause, Javier's vision began to blur. He was no longer the man everyone sought to please, the one whose words were always met with admiration. Now, he was a mere shadow, a figure who had lost his place in the grand story unfolding before him. He had always prided himself on being the one who held power, the one who controlled the room, but now he was simply a spectator to the rise of someone far greater than he could ever be. His lips parted, but no words came. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat, choked by the realization that his entire empire of pride and arrogance had crumbled in an instant. The truth, as raw and painful as it was, had exposed him for who he truly was. A man too consumed by his own ego to recognize the true power of humility, dignity, and love. Lucía reached the exit, but before she stepped through the door, she paused for a moment, turning back toward the room. The applause still echoed around her, but there was a stillness in her heart, a quiet that seemed to settle in the air. She stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the moment wash over her. She had fought for this. She had endured so much to get to this point, to find her place in a world that had never seen her for who she truly was. And now, at this very moment, she felt something stir deep within her. It wasn't just the recognition she had always craved. It was something much more profound. Acceptance. Acceptance of herself, her past, and the legacy of her mother that had always lived within her, even when she had tried to deny it. The guests, still applauding, seemed to be in a trance, captivated by the beauty and the grace of what they had just witnessed. They had seen something extraordinary, something they could never have predicted. Lucía had not just danced, she had lived through the dance. She had channeled her mother's spirit, her resilience and her passion, and in doing so she had shown them the true meaning of strength. In the corner of the room, Javier stood frozen, his eyes fixed on her retreating figure. The applause that had once been his now felt like a distant memory. It was as if he were standing on the outside of a world he no longer recognized. The luxury, the wealth, the power that he had once so confidently paraded before others, none of it mattered anymore. Lucía had shown them all what real power was, and it had nothing to do with money or status. It had everything to do with the heart. Javier's hands trembled at his sides. He had been stripped of everything. His fortune, his charm, his ability to command respect. All of it had vanished in the blink of an eye. The applause for Lucía felt like a mockery of everything he had built. She had taken something from him, something he hadn't even realized he was capable of losing. She had taken his pride, his sense of superiority, and she had replaced it with something far more valuable: truth. And yet, as the room erupted in celebration, Javier could not deny the sense of admiration he felt for Lucía. Deep down, he knew that she had won. She had won in a way that he never could have anticipated. She had danced, not for the applause, not for the recognition, but for something far greater. Her mother's memory, her own dignity, and the legacy of love and strength that had been passed down to her. Lucía, standing at the threshold of the door, turned one last time. Her face was still tear-streaked, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just a light of triumph, it was a light of peace. She had found her place in the world, and no one could take that away from her. "Thank you," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the noise of the room. "Thank you, Mother." With that, she stepped through the door, leaving behind the world that had tried to define her, stepping into a future where she was no longer invisible. She was Lucía Morales, daughter of Isabel Morales, a dancer, a woman of dignity and strength. And as the door closed behind her, the applause continued, fading into the distance. The room, once dominated by the figure of Javier Montero, now belonged to Lucía. She had become more than a symbol of power. She had become a symbol of hope, a beacon for all those who had ever felt invisible, unheard, or unseen. In the end, Lucía's story wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about reclaiming her identity, her strength, and her place in the world. And though Javier Montero stood there, defeated and broken, it was Lucía's name that would live on in the hearts and minds of all who had witnessed her transformation. She had not just danced for herself, she had danced for every woman who had ever been told she was not enough, for every person who had ever been made to feel small. Lucía Morales had shown them all that it was never about the things we are given. It is about the things we carry within us, the things that cannot be bought, and the things that cannot be taken away. As Lucía disappeared through the door, the claps and cheers still resonating behind her, a sense of calm washed over her. The night had begun as an ordeal, a test of her endurance and dignity, but it had transformed into something far greater. Lucía had not only reclaimed her identity, but she had done so in the most public, powerful way imaginable. She had become the person her mother had always wanted her to be, strong, resilient, and unafraid to face the world. Her steps were slow as she made her way through the grand hall, her uniform a stark contrast to the opulence of the palace around her. But it no longer mattered. The grandeur of the place, the lavishness of the surroundings, the wealth that had once held so much power, none of it seemed important now. What mattered was her truth, her self-respect, and the knowledge that she had won. Outside the hall, the night air was cool, and the streets of Madrid were alive with the quiet hum of a city that was completely unaware of the revolution that had just taken place inside the palace. Lucía paused for a moment, breathing deeply, the coolness of the night grounding her. She didn't know where the path ahead would lead, but for the first time in years, she felt free. She had walked into that ballroom carrying the weight of a past that had haunted her for so long, and now she carried something else entirely: hope. Back inside, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The room, once buzzing with the tension of humiliation and control, was now filled with a sense of reverence. The guests, still standing, had not sat down. They lingered in the silence that followed Lucía's exit, reflecting on what had just happened. What had been a moment of cruelty and mockery had turned into a testament to the strength of a woman who had endured so much but had never let go of her dignity. Javier, however, remained where he stood, his body rigid and unmoving. He felt as though the room was suffocating him. The applause had faded, but the weight of what had just transpired pressed down on him like a vice. He had always prided himself on his ability to command a room, to be the center of attention, but now he was nothing. He had become the very thing he had once mocked: insignificant. For the first time in his life, he was alone. His mind raced, replaying every word, every gesture. He had underestimated Lucía, and now the truth was inescapable. She had not just danced for herself, she had danced for every person who had ever been made to feel small, for every person who had been told they were not enough. And in doing so, she had turned the tables on him. and on everyone in that room who had ever believed in the power of money and status. Javier glanced around the room, but no one was looking at him. They were all still talking about Lucía, still basking in the light she had cast on them. His reputation, built so carefully over the years, had crumbled in an instant. The wealth, the status, the power, none of it mattered now. Lucía had taken it all from him, and he was left with nothing but the crushing weight of his own arrogance. One of the guests, a woman in a blue gown, leaned in toward her companion, speaking in a low voice. "Did you see the way she held herself? The strength in her movements. It was like watching a legend come back to life." Her words were heard by others, and the murmurs began again, this time with a tone of admiration. "She was incredible," another guest whispered. "A true artist." Javier's face flushed crimson. He wanted to shout, to lash out, but the words didn't come. All he could do was stand there, his hands shaking at his sides, as the weight of his loss settled in. He had tried to break Lucía, to humiliate her, to make her a joke. But she had turned it all back on him, exposing his own insecurities, his own weaknesses. The elderly man, who had recognized Lucía's true identity, spoke again, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "This is a night that will be remembered forever, not for the wealth in this room, nor for the luxury that surrounds us, but for the dignity that this woman, Lucía Morales, has shown us all." The applause started up again, this time quieter, more respectful, but it was no less powerful. Lucía had left the room, but her presence lingered in the air, filling the space with the energy of someone who had transcended the material world and stepped into something far greater, the realm of respect, of truth, of legacy. Javier took a few hesitant steps forward, as if trying to regain some semblance of control, but the weight of the room pressed down on him. Every eye was on him now, but not with admiration. No, the eyes that met his were filled with judgment, and a few with pity. He had become a symbol of arrogance, of a man who thought he could bend the world to his will, only to realize that in the end, it was the quiet strength of a woman who had the true power all along. Lucía had not sought revenge, nor had she sought to humiliate him. She had simply been herself, and in doing so, she had exposed the fragility of the empire he had built, an empire that had relied on cruelty, mockery, and superficiality. "Do you still think you can control everything?" the elderly man asked him, his voice cutting through the silence. "Do you still think that wealth is power?" Javier opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he just stood there, the weight of his own failure heavy on his shoulders. The guests, once eager to flatter him, now avoided his gaze. They had seen him for what he truly was, a man who lacked the one thing that truly mattered, the ability to connect with others on a human level, to understand the importance of humility, and to recognize the value of kindness. He took a deep breath, but it didn't help. The room was suffocating, and the longer he stood there, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on him. "I've lost everything," he whispered to himself, though no one else heard. But the answer wasn't in the wealth he had accumulated or the power he had once wielded. The answer was in the strength of a woman who had risen from the ashes of her past, who had walked into the room not to claim victory, but to honor a legacy that had been buried for too long. Lucía had shown him, and everyone in that room, that true power was not in what you could control, but in what you could inspire. And as the last echoes of applause faded into the night, Javier Montero realized that the most important lesson of all wasn't about winning or losing. It was about learning to live with integrity, humility, and respect. The rest of the night passed in a blur for him. He could hear the conversations around him, but none of them were about him. All the guests were talking about Lucía, about her grace, her strength, her legacy. And he was left standing there, alone, watching it all slip away. Outside, Lucía walked into the night, the cool air brushing her face. The city was quiet, the streets empty, and yet she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had walked into that ballroom with a past full of pain, but now she was free. She was no longer defined by her circumstances. She was no longer defined by the labels others had placed on her. She was Lucía Morales, and that was all she ever needed to be. Lucía stood at the edge of the city, her gaze lifting toward the sky where the stars twinkled like distant beacons. They seemed to shine with the same inner light that now burned within her, a light that had been ignited tonight in the most unexpected way. As she gazed at the constellations above, Lucía realized something profound. Her mother had never truly left her. She had always been there, in every step, in every movement, in the way Lucía now held herself with pride and strength. For so long, Lucía had carried the pain of her mother's death like a heavy cloak, believing that the world had closed in around her. But tonight, she had learned the most important lesson of all. Grief was not an end, but a part of the journey. Through the dance, through the raw vulnerability of the moment, she had come to understand that the love she had for her mother had not been buried with her. No, it was alive in every beat of her heart, in every movement she made. Tonight, she had not only honored her mother's legacy, she had embraced it as her own. Lucía had spent so many years hiding, concealing the woman she truly was, believing that she was nothing without her mother, nothing without the love and guidance she had lost. But now, as she walked through the quiet streets of Madrid, the world no longer seemed so vast or unreachable. She had found herself, not through the approval of others, not through the applause or the respect of those around her, but through the quiet, powerful connection she had with the memory of her mother, with the strength that flowed through her veins. The streets, now bathed in the soft light of early morning, felt like a new beginning, a world where the possibilities stretched out before her, waiting to be explored. Lucía walked slowly, the weight of the night still resting on her shoulders, but it was no longer a burden. The memories of the pain, the abandonment and the grief were no longer chains. They were the very foundation of the strength she had built over the years. She could hear the echoes of the applause in her mind, still reverberating through her consciousness. The recognition, the validation. It had been overwhelming, but more than that, it had been freeing. Lucía had not sought that validation. She had not wanted to be the center of attention. But in dancing for herself, in embracing her truth, she had unknowingly become the symbol of everything she had been denied. She had become the woman she had always feared she would never be, seen, respected, and unafraid to be herself. In the palace, Javier remained frozen, staring out of the grand window, the weight of his own realization crashing down upon him like a tidal wave. The applause that had once been his, now it seemed like a distant memory, something that had slipped through his fingers, irretrievably lost. His wealth, his power, the control he had once wielded over others, all of it seemed so meaningless now. The harsh reality of his actions, the cruelty he had tried to mask with arrogance and laughter, stood naked before him. Javier's gaze shifted to the empty space where Lucía had stood only moments before. He had underestimated her. He had believed that she was weak, a mere servant who could be controlled, humiliated, and discarded. But Lucía had proven him wrong in the most profound way. She had danced, not for him, not for the crowd, but for herself. And in doing so, she had become something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. A symbol of the power of dignity, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unbreakable strength of a woman who had been underestimated at every turn. For the first time in his life, Javier felt truly small. He had spent years building an empire based on wealth and status, but none of that mattered anymore. Lucía had shown him what true power looked like, and it had nothing to do with the things he had spent so much of his life collecting. It was in the quiet strength of a woman who had faced adversity and yet remained unbroken. As Javier stood there trying to make sense of what had happened, he realized that the night had not been about Lucía proving herself to him. It had been about Lucía proving something to herself. And in the process, she had changed everything, not just for herself, but for everyone who had witnessed her transformation. He stepped back from the window, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. There was no going back. The man he had once been, the man who believed he could control everything with money, charm, and power, was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the things that truly mattered could not be bought. The respect of others, the admiration of those around you, it wasn't something that could be purchased or forced. It was something that had to be earned through humility, integrity, and most of all, love. Meanwhile, Lucía continued her walk through the quiet streets, her pace steady and calm. She had no idea where this journey would take her, but she was no longer afraid. For the first time in her life, she had stepped into the unknown with courage. She had danced for her mother, yes, but more than that, she had danced for herself. And in doing so, she had found the strength to embrace the world as it was, without fear, without apology. As Lucía reached a small park, the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting off the quiet fountain, she stopped for a moment. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the night wash over her. She could still hear the echoes of the palace, the sound of applause, the weight of the night's events. But they no longer defined her. Lucía was not the woman who had been humiliated. She was not the servant who had been laughed at. She was not the girl who had lived in the shadows of her mother's memory. She was Lucía Morales, daughter of Isabel Morales, a dancer, a woman of dignity, and most of all, a woman who had finally embraced her own power. As the stars above twinkled in the dark sky, Lucía took a deep breath. Tonight had been the turning point, the moment when everything changed, and from this moment forward, she would never be the same.